The question for today is, how do we know that acetaminophen causes autism in susceptible babies and children? Well, there's about 20 different lines of evidence, and you can divide those lines of evidence up into different categories. So the first category that I like to talk about is our studies in laboratory animals. So in my own laboratory, we've found that you can give baby laboratory rats, laboratory rat pups we call them, acetaminophen at exactly the same doses that you give to children and babies. Of course, we adjust them for weight, but it's the same concentration. And we see long-term increases in anxiety in those animals. And by long-term, I mean when they grow up, they have more anxiety than animals that were in the what we call placebo group. Now, I don't even think my studies are the best studies. I think Henrik Viberg in Europe did an amazing job. He used laboratory mice, we use laboratory rats. These studies have been done in both mice and rats in different formats in different ways, and you always see adverse effects, even with fairly low doses of acetaminophen. And what Henrik found was that when you give a mouse a dose that's just barely more than we give to a baby, then they permanently lose their ability to learn, which is just amazing, truly amazing result. So what this means is that there is no way that this drug could ever be approved today if it went through FDA testing, because the FDA would say, hey, if it's causing long-term severe adverse events, which by definition, these kinds of changes in behavior and brain function are considered a major adverse event. These kinds of things can't be approved even for phase 1 clinical trials. In other words, you can't even try it in a child. So this is only one line of evidence. So a second line of evidence is that the mechanism of injury makes sense. We know how acetaminophen works. We've known, ironically or sadly, both probably since 1999, that children with severe autism can't process acetaminophen well. And we also know the pharmacology, toxicology, biochemistry of acetaminophen is well known. When you can't process that drug well, it becomes very toxic. It gets shunted off into your liver, and unfortunately, we now know from studies in lab animals that in the very small, in the very young, the brain is affected, not the liver. In adults, it's the liver. It gets shunted off into a very toxic pathway when you can't process that. And one of our most recent findings that we've talked about a little bit on social media is that, hey, we've known for 50 years that kitty cats can't handle acetaminophen. You say, well, why is that important? Well, that's important because kitty cats have a metabolic issue, we'll just call it an issue, that they can't process acetaminophen well. And it turns out that human babies are known to have the same issue. And that's been known since before we switched from aspirin to Tylenol. It's just nobody connected the dots together and realized that, hey, cats are a pretty good model for human babies in terms of their ability to process acetaminophen. So again, all of these studies in animals, they're sort of a second line of evidence, and we're only into a group of lines of evidence that all go into these animal studies. So in addition, we have associations in time. Now, associations in time are absolutely necessary. If you don't have an association in time, for example, if you have a crime that's committed and you think person X did it, but person X was nowhere in the area when the crime was committed, then person X didn't do it. A person X may have paid somebody to do it, but person X did not do it because they just weren't there. There's no association in time. So there's multiple associations in time of when we started to use acetaminophen and when we saw the pandemic of autism start to go up. And it deals with direct-to-consumer advertising. It deals with switching from aspirin to acetaminophen because of Reye syndrome that was associated with aspirin use. So there's a lot of these associations that don't prove anything, but they're very important. They add to the big picture and tell us what's going on. Now, there's also association with human activity, which are extremely compelling. For example, we know that infantile autism, which is the type of autism that we think that you're born with, or that it looks like you're born with, is associated with circumcision. There's in fact a twofold increased risk of infantile autism with circumcision. Now, what it looks like is the baby was born without autism, then they got circumcised, they got acetaminophen at that time, and then because of the injury, it's a chemical injury, then they eventually were diagnosed with autism. And then the second big association there is a Steve Schultz study. Stephen Schultz, his story's well known. You can find that on Amazon. He had a child that got vaccinated, got autism. I know several cases personally myself, but vaccines are not by themselves not associated with autism. So what's going on there? He quit his dentistry practice, went back, got his PhD, looking at, well, was it something we gave him with the vaccine? And the answer is absolutely positively yes, it was something, specifically it was acetaminophen. So these kinds of connections tell us that circumcision, vaccination, there's a common denominator there, which is acetaminophen. And that really puts the picture together for us, in addition to all the other stuff that I told you about. Now, there are miscellaneous things. There's some issues with manufacturing, too much active ingredient in children's Tylenol in Korea, and very high rates of autism. There is the effect on adults. Most people don't know that when an adult takes acetaminophen, they lose a lot of their social awareness. So somehow this drug is affecting social awareness. And of course, that is the hallmark of autism, is an impairment in social awareness. So, and that's the sort of the big picture of how we know that acetaminophen use in susceptible babies and children is causing autism.